Progress through dialogue. G20 has practical implications, ladies and gentlemen. Team Opposition presents you with 3 strong arguments in today's debate to support our claim that the G20 indeed does have practical implication. First of all, that the G20 facilitates international cooperation and promotes dialogue. Secondly, the benefits of press coverage and that's contribution to promoting an environment of exchange of ideas and communication. And lastly, how the G20 promotes exchange in the private sector as well, and how that leads to additional benefits and additional practical implications for the G20. Now, before moving on to our off-case arguments, I'd like to first step in to rebutting the few points mentioned by the Prime Minister. Now, we find the first problem in the PM's case about its definition. They said that in their definition, they say practical implications are actually yielding results in accordance with the goals of the G20. But in fact, they failed to show us exactly what the goals of the G20 is. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to tell you what the goals of the G20 was. According to the mission statement of the London 2009 summit, we strongly believe that mutual prosperity through cooperation should be the goals of the G20, and therefore we believe that this is a scope from which we must discuss today's debate. Now, on the Prime Minister's first argument about how it's non-binding, the first subpoint was about no enforceable commitments. We have two rebuttals to this. First of all, communication and exchange of ideas actually enables us to take a step further and actually coming up with a solution. The exchange of ideas have proved to actually produce tangible results, which I will elaborate in my arguments. Also, agreements have been passed on to binding bodies like the International Monetary Fund, and therefore, in these organizations, more specific agreements have been made. Through the G20, what we have are guidelines and principles. And when these guidelines and principles are sent to international organizations with binding power, we see that practical solutions and practical policies, specific policies, are actually being devised. And this I would like to elaborate further on in my off-case argument. Also, the second subpoint, was that there is no dispute settlement policy. First of all, we believe that disputes have been already settled in many cases, regardless of what they argue about there being no dispute settlement policy. And because we believe that they failed to elaborate upon this point, that this rebuttal is enough.
1 point, sir.
No, thank you. On their third point, about no incentive, we believe that G20 states have a common incentive for common prosperity. And as this is the case, they have an incentive not to have the other nation's policy go against their interests, and therefore they do have an incentive to cooperate and voice out their opinions actively in the global stage. Also, on their fourth subpoint about the absence of a permanent secretariat, we still believe that the G20 has practical implications, as was in the case of the G8, which also didn't have a permanent secretariat. What we saw was close interaction between the head of states and finance ministers, as well as other public servants, and how that led to the contribution of producing a better solution for the future and the world. Ladies and gentlemen, also, on the last issue about no agreements being made, we believe that this is factually incorrect, as I will prove on later in my arguments. Now, moving on to our first off-case argument about how it facilitates international cooperation and promotes dialogue and enables solutions, ladies and gentlemen. We see that there is a clear need in today's world for international cooperation. Global challenges demand a common and unified answer, a common policy, ladies and gentlemen. This is the reason of existence of the G20. G20 promotes dialogue and better cooperation, and 2 facets of the G20 actually enable this. First of all, its process. Greater personal contact and more common understanding of policy changes is what comes as a result of G20 summits and meetings, ladies and gentlemen. The G7 meetings, which have been held before the G20 meetings, substituted the G8, which came from the G7, ladies and gentlemen, is close and repeated personal contact and increased agreement on what the other perspective is. And therefore, we see that the same things are actually taking place, and the same things will continue to take place in future G20 summits as well. Another major point is about efficiency. Summit meetings means that head of states gather together, ladies and gentlemen, and discuss the matter, and decisions are made without the unnecessary delay that many other forms of negotiation do have, ladies and gentlemen. In most other cases of negotiations, representatives negotiate with the representatives of other nations, and when there is an agreement reached, they have to go back to the executive body, get their approval, and then come back. And what if they're rejected, ladies and gentlemen? They need to renegotiate from a clean slate, ladies and gentlemen. And this is why we believe that the G20 offers a clear and effective solution to the problems of the status quo. And now I'd like to elaborate further on this argument with presenting you with tangible results, ladies and gentlemen. In the 2009 London Summit, ladies and gentlemen, about approximately $1.1 trillion in additional loans and guarantees to bail out troubled countries was a principle agreed upon by the member states of the G20. In the Gwangju agreements in 2010, they agreed to expand the representation of emerging market countries by 6%, ladies and gentlemen. And they also endorsed an expansion of an IMF lending programs to failing countries suffering from credit crunches, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that these principles have been established, and as I mentioned to you in my rebuttal speech, we believe that these principles get passed on to other international organizations with binding force and are actually implemented and conveyed into practical and specific policies, ladies and gentlemen. Also, in the Seoul Agreement in 2010, they required banks to increase risk-free capital from the average of 2% in the status quo to 7% by the year 2015, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that this is significant progress on the part of an international conference, ladies and gentlemen. Another major issue that I'd like to bring up is our second argument about the benefits of press attention. G20 agenda received great public spotlight, ladies and gentlemen. Suggestions and predictions about G20 agendas are presented from various media, ladies and gentlemen. Columnists like Nicholas Kristof or Paul Krugman voiced out their opinions on what should be included in the G20 summit, and people discuss about these agendas. People express their opinions, a public forum is created, and it flourishes, ladies and gentlemen. Citizenry participation increases, and international concerns do receive public spotlight, and governments can actually take this into consideration in their policy making. Ladies and gentlemen, the press influences citizens and encourages them to speak out and to voice out their opinions. And it actually contributes to problem solving through the exchange of ideas and enabling governments to take the opinions of their citizens into consideration. And this is exactly why we believe that this also contributes to the factor of practical implications. Solutions through communication, progress through dialogue, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Speaker has spoken for 7 minutes 12 seconds.